Well, what a wonderful talk and what a wonderful day. I wanted to just start by thanking our speakers, fascinating talks, and the whole audience for asking amazing questions, great poster presentations, and so on. And now we have half an hour for a sort of general discussion. I think the four speakers, if you can turn on um,
Microphone.
your audio and video, at least your video for now, that would be great. So people can post, you can post questions in the Q&A, and I'll try to monitor those and ask them. You could ask everyone, or you can ask, direct your question to sort of one person. But maybe I'll start with a couple of questions for everybody. So the first question is, in all of the talks, it really came up, this idea of, I'll use David's term, statistical universal constraints or cultural tendencies. So this idea that they exist really was supported in all of the talks. And so the next question really is, where do they come from? So are these constraints based on our evolved brain structures? Are they based on our bodies and how they move? So there's some idea of embodied cognition. Are they based on a common environment? What answers do we have so far? And what questions do we need to ask, and how can we address this in the future? I'll just randomly pick someone because I can see Sam to start us off with his ideas.
So we don't know, I think. There's a number of views about this that are out there. There's a special issue of BBS coming out. I'm not sure when it's coming out actually, but it's under commentary now with a couple of views about this, which many people here might be familiar with already. My personal view on it is that quite a few features in human behavior and human perception are a result of adaptations that are specific to those areas. We think of, for instance, our preferences for sugar and fat, our visual and aesthetic preferences in scenes, for example, our sort of scary ability to pick out speech in noisy environments, for example, is often interpreted as a bias towards hearing language when it's difficult to do so. In the case of music, I think that the body of cross-cultural work is pointing towards at least some fundamental aspects of the behavior in question that seem to turn up everywhere and that are culturally elaborated once they're there. If I had to bet on it, I'd say that one of those has to do with tonal hierarchies and tonal organization, and another one has to do with metrical hierarchies and metrical organization. And that's not to say that tonality is similar everywhere. I mean, obviously it's not the same everywhere, but it shares features across cultures in ways that can be elaborated so that you can give rise to higher level representations of the sort that my lab is really interested in. So I think that those sorts of kind of building blocks are good candidates for, innate, specifically adapted outcomes in the mind. But I think that the onus for showing those is fairly high. Like the standard of evidence for making a claim like that is sufficiently high that I don't think anyone's really justified in taking it to the bank quite yet. So that's sort of what I think about it. But there's a lot of views on that, so maybe we're wrong.
Yeah, I don't know. Beatriz, did you want to comment on?
Well, I can say one thing. I think we need to understand that when we talk about the frequency of phenomena, we need to consider both the strength of the causal effect, but also its consistency. So you can have a very small perceptual effect that you will not be able to measure with a single individual, but that effect will be very consistent. So for example, tuning an instrument, right? So, perceptual effect of like resonant frequency of two strings can be very salient, it can be not very salient. But every time we'll tune an instrument, we'll have the same phenomena. this resonant frequency between the different strings. And that's with a lot of repeated experience can accumulate quite a strong force of shaping similarities. So I think that we need to really consider the consistencies. So not everything we'll see a lot of times is because it comes from a very strong causal effect that we make a psychological experiment, we'll measure it. But it could be also from something very consistent, even if it's small in every single instance.
Yeah, and Beatrice, maybe you can comment on the developmental aspects of looking at the question.
You know, two things that occurred to me. I agree with Sam. I think that, you know, there's the adaptation piece, but I also think that a lot of, you know, the music and these differences, they also have to do with how people respond to the environments they're in. So there's that interaction with the environment as well. And of course, there's, you know, there's some commonalities, I guess, in terms of, you know, the developing brain and some of the things that we've learned along the way. But I do think that a lot of music making and what we see, and we know this from ethnomusicology as well, is a response, the themes that people sing, how they sing and how they bring people together and so on. So there's that is this interaction and from the developmental world where we say, and we're thinking more in terms of developmental systems. To me, it makes a lot of sense. It is really this interaction of all these things, you know, your brain, genetics, your behavior, and also your environment. At least in the experiences that I've seen, just within Brazil, the topics are so different that children are singing, yet they're still singing, and they, you know, maybe their starting pitches are similar for some songs, even some of the you know, traditional songs, or so there's some commonality, but there's also a lot of responses to the environment.
I can add some things.
Sure, go ahead.
Yeah, I think so. I agree with what people are saying. My colleagues are saying here that just to give examples, I think, for example, the influence of the body on music. The simplest example I can give is the intermission, which is conditioned by the capacity of the human bladder. There are many people who, concert goers, who were really thankful for the intermission. That's just a trivial example. There are lots of other examples. In the case of the environment, I think many of us as musicians have all had the experience, or just ordinary human beings, of going into a stairwell. And the thing about reverberation is that it gives you, it's tremendously acoustically efficient. And it makes a lot of sense why, you know, our ancestors would have been so thrilled about doing things in caves, because you put a little bit of energy in there and you get a lot of bang for your buck in those sorts of environments. And I think, you know, then we have all sort of cognitive and perceptual phenomena, things like categorical perception or the near exposure effect. These are all going to have influences on how music gets put together, how we experience it, and so forth. And then there's my own pet thing that I'm on about ethological theory of signals and the cue signal distinction, which I think is very important in terms of understanding how emotion-related displays are interpreted by respondents. And I think that plays into all of this, and I think is a nice foundational concept for evolutionary psychology.
Great, thanks. The next question is by Niels Hansen, and it's actually the next question I was going to ask. So actually, that's great. So he says, David and others have mentioned how globalization has made cross-cultural music cognition research more difficult in practical terms. This is definitely true, but do you think increasing globalization makes cross-cultural questions more or less important? And what I would add to that is, what are the most important questions that we should be addressing? We know that different musical cultures are disappearing at a faster rate than language, for example. What are the most important questions as a community that we should be addressing in terms of cross-cultural work before we lose chances to get at certain questions?
That's a question for all of us, right?
For all of you, yeah. You can start, David.
Ooh.
I have a skeptical comment before we got to delve in this question. I think that the main constraint here is not like the idea of cultural isolate. That's a fantasy, and that's something we just not going to have. But what we're interested is something that we are interested of population that are not completely exposed. Their exposure is not completely saturated by globalization. And actually it's much easier to find population that even though they have some exposure, they have a lot of exposure to a particular local culture. And we've seen it in our data that results, for example, people in Montevideo, Uruguay, who are definitely exposed to Western music, but their results are very, very extreme in terms of the cultural structure they're measuring. They're basically like looking like an isolate. Even though they're not isolated, just rising born on a particular very local, strong musical tradition with a lot of pride, and they're doing those candombe music, beautiful style of music from early age. It's a very strong kind of natural pride, even for those population who are a little bit marginalized in other terms. And so those are beautiful examples of not cultural isolate, but strong cultural things that we can measure. Still a lot of cultural variability within this
Right.
group.
So Nori, what is the most important thing to measure in these populations? Given that we might have limited time, even, among what you describe.
I don't think we have a limited time. I think that in the same time that we have this globalization happens, we have been building niche. So maybe the next cross-cultural research would be on people who listen all the time to weird kind of particular type of pop music, and the internet in the same time that it puts a lot of global experience also create beautiful places for very, very nuanced niches. So I think that's like, we have a lot of time. We're gonna do it forever.
So that's the optimist
Nori's
view.
an optimist.
That's what I said, the optimist view. So does anyone else want to weigh in?
I'm not nearly so optimistic. So the music that's heard all over the world, that people that everybody's sharing is film music. And film music is very much, the Western art, classical, orchestral tradition of Beethoven and Brahms is alive and well, and it's not living in university schools of music, it's living in Hollywood. The person who sounds most like Beethoven these days is John Williams, right? And that music is all over the world. And I think, I take your point, Nori, that I think that's right, that there are all these niches that are going to happen and so on. But if we're going to try to convince people who are skeptics that this, A, B, and C are, statistical universals, and we're relying on these sort of niche groups and so forth, I just think you're going to have a huge amount of skepticism amongst the anthropologists and ethnomusicologists. I think it's going to be a hard thing to claim.
But the thing is that, it's, let me push back on David, not that I disagree with you, but I mean, I in fact, earlier in this same window, I chatted almost exactly what you just said privately to David. So I am on board, but let's just play devil's advocate for a minute. I mean, there's an entire field of cultural evolution research that sides with Nori here, because, there's an enormous number of methods in Bayesian phylogenetic modeling that let you just measure. Sure, you don't have isolates, but you have people who are at opposite ends of the phylogenetic tree, and all you have to do is regress. You need to measure something about their cultural distance, whether it's their, a feature of their language phylogeny or a feature of their social hierarchy or their religious practices or so on, and just measure it. So I guess I would say that, while it is the case that, studying true isolates is basically impossible at this point, and studying people who are majority isolates, let's say, is becoming harder and harder. At the same time, our methods toolkit is getting quite a bit more sophisticated to try and deal with that sort of problem. So I'm of two minds here. I mean, I kind of agree with David that there's the globalization issue is a little bit sort of, it's a hard nut to crack, but Nori's right, practically speaking, that, to the extent that there is cross-cultural variability, we can measure that variability and try and predict it. But to answer, and actually that point is kind of relevant to the previous question, in the sense that there are going to be human universals that have nothing to do with the structure of our minds. You know, the bathroom break after such and such number of minutes is a human universal. I don't know if it's a relative universal or not, but like many cultures are going to come up with that intermission independently of one another, and it's going to look like a human universal, despite the fact that it has nothing to do with our minds. But that's okay. I mean, to the extent that our jobs are to, you know, figure out what the structure of the mind is and understand, you know, how the building blocks of our psychology give rise to musical behavior and music perception, we're going to need to isolate, you know, independently recurring cultural traits from innate aspects of our psychology. But, you know, so I guess, you know, I'm answering question number 3 as well, which is that's to me, that's the big question to get at here, regardless of what the state is of isolates. I think that's an area where we have a lot of work to do, because, you know, if you ask 10 psychologists of music what the building blocks are, you get 10 different answers these days. So, you know, that's the big question for me.
Yeah, and I might just jump in here too with a sort of side question related. Isabel Peretz asks, why are these musics disappearing? And just to elaborate a little bit on that question, you know, is it the case that Western music is taking over, and if so, why? Or is it the case that lots of different influences are being spread around the world?
I mean, Beatriz might know the best of us.
Well, I think culture is very dynamic, right? And that's always a dilemma. Do we keep it? Do we, you know, maintain it like in a folklore sense of way with a lot of nostalgia? And to what extent do we do that, or we just let it go and let it transform into something else? I know that anthropologists discuss that as well. But I guess, you know, with globalization, with media, and I think what David was saying, I had the same experience with the riverine in the Amazon. They listen to a lot of radio. The radio is really important actually in those communities, right? And maybe it's for 3 hours, but that's the music, and they know Caribbean music. So a lot of them know some words in Spanish and some of the rhythms that come from the Caribbean, which are not Brazilian, but that have been incorporated. So there's a lot of hybridization as well, and a lot of genres that we can't even imagine that people are mixing and matching and, you know, creating new things. So there's a lot going on. And the question, I guess, that we're all discussing here is, you know, who owns that music? That's the other piece, right? How can I say that that is more Brazilian because it has 20% of this rhythm or that, or, you know, where does it fit in? And are these communities kind of organizing beyond geographical boundaries as well? So how do we go about, you know, looking at that? I think it's kind of inevitable. And I know David wrote this paper in 2010 that I always read with my students, the Christina Aguilera in the jungle, because it's so pertinent. And the same happens in the world I live in education, which we're, you know, teaching songs sometimes from 100 years ago and expecting kids to like it. And then we say, well, the kids don't like it. Are we doing the right thing? So I guess these questions, you know, connect in all fields.
If I could piggyback on just what you said there, I think there's also an issue related to sort of cultural preservation and just how, and this is a very loaded term, how authentic they are. So I've spent a lot of time listening to Francis Densmore recordings of Native American music, and for a trained musicologist, when you listen, so the people, there are First Nations, Native American tribes that are really making an effort to try to preserve their cultural traditions, and especially with regard to powwows and music and so forth. But when I contrast what I hear in the Densmore recordings with what I hear in, say, modern Lakota powwows, I can hear immediately that they're singing in equal temperament. They're choosing the pitches. You know, I could demonstrate, but I'll not demonstrate. But they're basically have shifted the whole pitch structure so that although it sounds, and to ordinary people, it sounds authentically Lakota, and it's very similar to what you would hear in some of these Densmore recordings. There are all these subtle ways in which it's been very much Westernized. And the people who are producing these things are convinced of the authenticity of what they're doing. And of course, it is authentically them. They are doing what it is that they do, and it's their music, these things. But we shouldn't kid ourselves that they're not being influenced by these things. And to follow up on what Sam earlier said, I completely agree with you. In the sense that I emphasized several times that we shouldn't underestimate the intelligence and resourcefulness of future researchers to figure stuff out and to get at things that, you know, right now we don't know how to get at. But you know, just to put the cherry on the top of this, this is the one point in human history where we have sophisticated understandings of human psychology, the ability to conduct experiments, the ability to travel to very remote parts of the world, and to find people that are relatively isolated in terms of their cultural experiences. I think that future researchers are going to look at our generation right now, and they're going to be cursing us for our inaction, because this will never happen again. This is a unique period in human history.
But wait, it's not inaction. We are doing it.
Well,
so everybody's labs are working on this.
Yeah,
you guys are, but frankly, there's not that many people that are doing what you guys are doing.
Well, tell the funders.
Yeah, but I mean, maybe a related question is, you know, being resourceful and taking advantage of things, is maybe we should also be spending some time studying how different musics come together. So I know ethnomusicologists look at this, but in the science or psychology of music, I don't think we have spent much effort on that. And that's surely going to tell us stuff, you know, like what part of what music is preserved when two or more cultures come together. Yeah. That probably also could tell us something about universals. I don't know anyone.
There's a little bit of work. Michael Schober, I think, has a couple of papers on like getting people from different traditions to play together and like seeing. I don't remember the papers exactly, but there's something sort of in this vein. Maybe others know it better than I do.
Just to make a plug for the concert tonight, they're going to talk about the three musicians all have different backgrounds musically, and they play, you know, what's called jazz, which could be almost anything. But they're going to talk a bit about how they came together, and so I hope you can all go to that, because the dialogue will be interesting as well as the music. I should move on to, there have been a couple of questions where people would love to hear your perspectives on the definition of music across cultures. Definition of musical units, like notes and beats across cultures, and how that impacts our research in this field, especially psychological experiments that focus on like implicit concepts and representations. That's from Elizabeth Phillips.
I think that the interesting aspect of the research that we're trying to do is to reconsider what are the elements, the basic elements of music. Like an interesting result of a research program like that is like we've seen multiple cultures, and now we need to think back, what are the elements? And so that's I think what we can potentially learn, and that has an implication beyond just the music psychology, because the elements that we'll learn, some of them are musical structure, but something like categorical perception is actually something pretty broad that is going beyond the music psychology. So potentially what are the basic building blocks of the mind. That is one thing we can take out from the cross-cultural work.
I think just to address more specifically the question here, all concepts are fuzzy. There's no concept that's clear. So I think what we do as experimentalists is that we're always operationalizing terms. So things that you think are clear, like think of all sorts of psychological concepts like empathy or happiness. We talk about these things all the time. First of all, as though they're real, and I hope they are real. But in research, we always have to. We can never grasp a concept fully. We're always going to be forced to some sort of operationalized approximation of what we think is a note or a piece of music or whatever. And I think we shouldn't worry too much about it. The question is whether, as a reader, when you're reading the research, how they've operationalized something like empathy or happiness or energy or whatever seems to make some sort of reasonable sense to you as a reader, and think, okay, yeah, that's probably strongly correlated with what I deeply think intelligence or happiness or empathy or whatever happens to be. These are going to be perpetual problems, and we're never going to grasp any of these concepts fully.
Yeah, it's particularly problematic across cultures when,
Yeah.
within a culture we may have a common concept even if we can't define, but I guess it's not clear if that's true across cultures. Anyone want to comment on that?
I mean, I guess I would just say that, like, there are certainly some aspects of behavior in different cultures that no one would disagree are observable or present in cultures. We can we'll continue with David's bladder example just for the sake of levity. But I mean, the question is just, what are the kind of fuzzy boundaries of this music category? And, personally, because my research interests are along the lines of what Nori was just describing, finding out what are these building blocks. For me, I'm more interested in edge cases than other people might be. And because it's a fuzzy category, there are always going to be edge cases. There are things that people are going to observe in some other culture, and they might say that's music, and the culture would say, well, actually that's not, or vice versa. And to me, that's not only fine, but it's expected, because that's the nature of a fuzzy category. But because we're interested I'm not sure how well you can hear this, baby. Because we're not necessarily focusing so much on these edge cases. Really, what matters are for these sorts of questions are like canonical things that really everybody would agree are something like music. So I guess I tend to not focus so much on this question. But I realize, like, sociologically, this is like a much bigger question outside of the field of psychology than it is in psychology, I think, if that makes sense.
Any other comments on that? I could ask, Michelle asks a similar question, is there a Chomskyan-like biologically based universal grammar of emotional expressiveness in music, of which David's statistical universals are components? I mean, I guess in a sense, that's trying to define music in terms of some kind of a Chomskyan grammatical system.
I think there is two components what the proposal. One of them that it's related to emotion, and one of them that there is some kind of structural components. With respect to the emotion, I think it's related to emotional research, like in the sense of like the shared things going to be shared emotion if they are across cultures. And then if they are shared emotion, then people will try to express them in music, or at least some of them, and those will be shared. With respect to the structural aspect, I think there is something unique about the structure of music, which is different from other components, and also there's also shared cognitive resources that are definitely important in music. And those shared component in terms of cognitive resources, they're going to be pretty common across cultures. I think that's tractable for us to study.
I mean, I think the main thing is to take seriously the possibility of some kind of Chomskyan musical grammar and evaluate it empirically. I mean, on a strong interpretation of Nori's results, something like simple integer ratios as in rhythm production and rhythm perception, would form some kind of Chomskyan module, or whatever you want to call it, that then is culturally elaborated into these other rhythms that don't turn up consistently across cultures. So I think a kind of fair answer to the question is, well, we don't really know, but if we're doing our jobs properly, that possibility needs to be in the hypothesis space of how we interpret the results that are coming in across cultures. Similarly, if you really buy our representation of musical functions stuff, whether or not you do, simulate for a second that you do, you know, it's entirely possible that that's another Chomskyan, you know, building block where, you know, from the, you know, tonal and metrical information that's present, you know, in a song, from the timbral and stylistic elements that are also there, you make some kind of higher level, you know, interpretation that is going to be somewhat consistent across cultures. But I don't think we're there yet. I mean, I don't think anybody would be willing to stake, you know, I don't think it's the hill anyone's going to die on quite yet. But it's certainly an interesting hypothesis. You know, it reminds me a bit of like Mark Baker's book, The Atoms of Language, which, you know, where he sort of lays out a periodic table of the chunks that go into language, what makes language the way it is. I don't think anyone's really done that for music in a sort of 2020 up-to-date version of what we know is likely to be universal across cultures. But it would be interesting to see what that looks like.
I think what Sam has been doing is a very positive engine in that direction. I think the sort of the musical categories that you're pulling out there, and I think there are going to be things that we can point to that have a biological basis for it that explains some of these things. So, you know, anthropologists, for example, if you look at weeping behaviors, I mean, there are circumstances in which people cry because they're experiencing joy, or they're laughing so hard it brings them to tears and so on. But the most common experience then is grief with associated weeping. And anthropologists, I've got lots of quotes of anthropologists around the world who feel that they don't even need to describe the weeping behavior in a particular culture. They say it's transparently obvious what's happening when someone has died and people are crying. And in some of the work that we've done, for example, with regard to breaking voice, it's very clear that when a singer, as in, you know, you get country Western tunes, you see it in opera as well, where where you go from falsetto into modal voice, this cracking voice, which arises from the constriction of the pharynx related to what happens with grief-related weeping. I think everybody gets this. And so I think that we're going to, and my argument would be the reason why is because of what ethologists call a signal, and that these are actually, they're genetic, they're part of the innate human behavior. I think we are going to find a handful of these things that are extant in music that we can identify that are going to have this very strong statistical universal, if you want to call it, across all these cultures, that people will get it. I think there's an awful lot of room for cultural variation and a lot of other things that are going on that are culture specific, but I do think there are probably going to be a handful of these things related to sadness and joy and anger and so on that are pretty readily identifiable in the acoustic signal.
Yeah, although they may not be specific to music either. Right?
Yes, that's right.
So any last comments? We're out of time from anyone? Okay, I take that as a no. So I just want to thank you all again. It was a great day. Your talks were so interesting. Thanks to the moderators, thanks to the organizers, thanks to our sponsors. And hope to see you at the concert tonight. And I hope to see you next year. Okay.
Well, before you hang up, I think I can speak on behalf of all the panelists and everybody else that we know that you're really the brains and motor behind all of this. And really, you're the one that deserves a big round of applause. And thank you very much for putting all of this together.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks, Laurel.
Thank you.
Great. So good night, everyone.
Night.